it chapter by chapter, one bite at a time. So many adventures and mountains we can climb. Take it word for word, line by line, one bite at a time.
Welcome to Bite at a Time Books, where we read you your favorite classics one bite at a time. My name is Bree Carlile, and I love to read, and wanted to share my passion with listeners like you. If you want to know what's coming next and vote on upcoming books, sign up for our newsletter at biteatatimebooks.com. You'll also find our new t-shirts in the shop, including podcast shirts and quote shirts from your favorite classic novels. Be sure to follow my show on your favorite podcast platform so you get all the new episodes. You can find most of our links in the show notes, but also our website, biteatatimebooks.com, includes all of the links for our show, including to our Patreon to support the show, and YouTube, where we have special behind the narration of the episodes. We're part of the Bite at a Time Books Productions Network. If you'd also like to hear what inspired your favorite classic authors to write their novels, and what was going on in the world at the time, check out the Bite at a Time Books Behind the Story podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. Please note, while we try to keep the text as close to the original as possible, some words have been changed to honor the marginalized communities who've identified the words as harmful, and to stay in alignment with Bite at a Time Books' brand values. Today we'll be continuing Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Chapter 3. The ankle chain must have undergone a certain preparatory manipulation to be thus broken with a blow from a hammer. Towards the end of October in that same year, 1823, the inhabitants of Toulon beheld the entry into their port, after heavy weather, and for the purpose of repairing some damages of the ship Orion, which was employed later at Brest as a school ship, and which then formed a part of the Mediterranean squadron. This vessel, battered as it was, for the sea had handled it roughly, produced a fine effect as it entered the roads. It flew some colors which procured for it the regulation salute of 11 guns, which it returned, shot for shot, total 22. It has been calculated that what with salvos, royal and military politeness, courteous exchanges of uproar, signals of etiquette, formalities of roadsteads and citadels, sunrises and sunsets, saluted every day by all the fortresses and all ships of war, openings and closings of ports, etc. The civilized world discharged all over the earth in the course of 24 hours, 150,000 useless shots. At 6 francs the shot, that comes to 900,000 francs a day, 300 millions a year which vanish in smoke. This is a mere detail. All this time, the poor were dying of hunger. The year 1823 was what the Restoration called the epoch of the Spanish War. This war contained many events in one, and a quantity of peculiarities. A grand family affair for the House of Bourbon, the branch of France succoring and protecting the branch of Madrid. That is to say, performing an act devolving on the elder, an apparent return to our national traditions, complicated by servitude and by subjection to the cabinets of the North. Monsieur le Duc d'Angoulême, surnamed by the liberal sheets the hero of Andujar, compressing in a triumphal attitude that was somewhat contradicted by his peaceable air. The ancient and very powerful terrorism of the Holy Office at variance with the chimerical terrorism of the liberals. The sans-culottes resuscitated, to the great terror of dowagers, under the name of descamisados. Monarchy opposing an obstacle to progress described as anarchy. The theories of '89 roughly interrupted in the sap. A European halt called to the French idea which was making the tour of the world. Beside the son of France is Generalissimo, the Prince de Carignan. Afterwards, Charles Albert, enrolling himself in that crusade of kings against people as a volunteer, with grenadier epaulets of red worsted, the soldiers of the empire setting out on a fresh campaign, but aged, saddened after 8 years of repose, and under the white cockade, the tricolored standard waved abroad by a heroic handful of Frenchmen, as the white standard had been 30 years earlier at Koblenz. Monks mingled with our troops. The spirit of liberty and of novelty brought to its senses by bayonets, principles slaughtered by cannonades, France undoing by her arms that which she had done by her mind. In addition to this, hostile leaders sold, soldiers hesitating, cities besieged by millions, no military perils and yet possible explosions, as in every mine which is surprised and invaded, but little bloodshed, little honor won, shame for some, glory for no one. Such was this war made by the princes descended from Louis XIV and conducted by generals who had been under Napoleon. Its sad fate was to recall neither the Grand War nor grand politics. Some feats of arms were serious. The taking of Trocadero, among others, was a fine military action. But after all, we repeat, the trumpets of this war give back a cracked sound. The whole effect was suspicious. History approves of France for making a difficulty about accepting this false triumph. It seemed evident that certain Spanish officers charged with resistance yielded too easily. The idea of corruption was connected with the victory. It appears as though generals and not battles had been won, and the conquering soldier returned humiliated. A debasing war, in short, in which the Bank of France could be read in the folds of the flag. Soldiers of the War of 1808, on whom Saragossa had fallen in formidable ruin, frowned in 1823 at the easy surrender of citadels, and began to regret Palafox. It is the nature of France to prefer to have Rostopchine, rather than Ballesteros in front of her. From a still more serious point of view, and one which it is also proper to insist upon here, this war, which wounded the military spirit of France, enraged the democratic spirit. It was an enterprise of enthrallment. In that campaign, the object of the French soldier, the son of democracy, was the conquest of a yoke for others. A hideous contradiction. France is made to arouse the soul of nations, not to stifle it. All the revolutions of Europe since 1792 are the French Revolution. Liberty darts raised from France. That is a solar fact. Blind is he who will not see. It was Bonaparte who said it. The War of 1823, an outrage of the generous Spanish nation, was then, at the same time, an outrage on the French Revolution. It was France who committed this monstrous violence, by foul means, for, with the exception of wars of liberation, everything that armies do is by foul means. The words passive obedience indicate this. An army is a strange masterpiece of combination where force results from an enormous sum of impotence. Thus is war made by humanity against humanity, despite humanity explained. As for the Bourbons, the War of 1823 was fatal to them. They took it for a success. They did not perceive the danger that lies in having an idea slain to order. They went astray in their innocence to such a degree that they introduced the immense enfeeblement of a crime into their establishment as an element of strength. The spirit of the ambush entered into their politics. 1830 had its germ in 1823. The Spanish campaign became in their councils an argument for force and for adventures by right divine. France, having reestablished El Rey Neto in Spain, might well have reestablished the absolute king at home. They fell into the alarming error of taking the obedience of the soldier for the consent of the nation. Such confidence is the ruin of thrones. It is not permitted to fall asleep, either in the shadow of a machinelle tree nor in the shadow of an army. Let us return to the ship Orion. During the operations of the army commanded by the Prince Generalissimo, a squadron had been cruising in the Mediterranean. We have just stated that the Orion belonged to this fleet, and that accidents of the sea had brought it into port at Toulon. presence of a vessel of war in a port has something about it which attracts and engages a crowd. It is because it is great, and the crowd loves what is great. A ship of the line is one of the most magnificent combinations of the genius of man with the powers of nature. A ship of the line is composed, at the same time, of the heaviest and the lightest of possible matter, for it deals at one and the same time with three forms of substance: solid, liquid, and fluid, and it must do battle with all three. It has 11 claws of iron with which to seize the granite on the bottom of the sea, and more wings and more antennae than winged insects, to catch the wind in the clouds. Its breath pours out through its 120 cannons as through enormous trumpets, and replies proudly to the thunder. The ocean seeks to lead it astray in the alarming sameness of its billows. But the vessel has its soul, its compass, which counsels it and always shows it the north. In the blackest nights, its lanterns supply the place of the stars. Thus, against the wind, it has its cordage and its canvas. Against the water, wood. Against the rocks, it's iron, brass, and lead. Against the shadows, it's light. Against immensity, a needle. If one wishes to form an idea of all those gigantic proportions, which, taken as a whole, constitute the ship of the line, one has only to enter one of the 6-story covered construction stocks, in the ports of Brest or Toulon. The vessels in process of construction are under a bell glass there, as it were. This colossal beam is a yard. That great column of wood, which stretches out on the earth as far as the eye can reach, is the main mast. Taking it from its root in the stocks to its tip in the clouds, it is 60 fathoms long, and its diameter at its base is 3 feet. The English mainmast rises to a height of 217 feet above the waterline. The navy of our fathers employed cables. Ours employs chains. The simple pile of chains on a ship of 100 guns is 4 feet high, 20 feet in breadth, and 8 feet in depth. And how much wood is required to make this ship? 3,000 cubic meters. It is a floating forest. And moreover, let this be borne in mind, it is only a question here of the military vessel of 40 years ago, of the simple sailing vessel. Steam, then in its infancy, has since added new miracles to that prodigy which is called a war vessel. At the present time, for example, the mixed vessel with a screw is a surprising machine, propelled by 3,000 square meters of canvas and by an engine of 2,500 horsepower. Not to mention these new marvels. The ancient vessel of Christopher Columbus and De Ruyter is one of the masterpieces of man. It is as inexhaustible in force as is the infinite in gales. It stores up the wind in its sails. It is precise in the immense vagueness of the billows. It floats, and it rains. There comes an hour, nevertheless, when the gale breaks that 60-foot yard like a straw. When the wind bends that mast 400 feet tall. When that anchor, which weighs tens of thousands, is twisted in the jaws of the waves like a fisherman's hook in the jaws of a pike. When those monstrous cannons utter plaintive and futile roars, which the hurricane bears forth into the void and into the night. When all that power and all that majesty are engulfed in a power and majesty which are superior. Every time that immense force is displayed to culminate in an immense feebleness, it affords men food for thought. Hence, in the ports, curious people abound around these marvelous machines of war and of navigation, without being able to explain perfectly to themselves why. Every day accordingly, from morning until night, the quays, sluices, and the jetties of the port of Toulon were covered with a multitude of idlers and loungers, as they say in Paris, whose business consisted in staring at the Orion. The Orion was a ship that had been ailing for a long time. In the course of its previous cruises, thick layers of barnacles had collected on its keel to such a degree as to deprive it of half its speed. It had gone into the dry dock the year before this, in order to have the barnacles scraped off. Then it had put to sea again. But this cleaning had affected the bolts of the keel. In the neighborhood of the Berlik Isles, the sides had been strained and had opened. And as the plating in those days was not of sheet iron, the vessel had sprung a leak. A violent equinoctial gale had come up, which had first staved in a grating and a porthole on the larboard side, and damage to the foretop gallant shrouds in consequence of these injuries. The Orion had run back to Toulon. It anchored near the arsenal. It was fully equipped, and repairs were begun. The hull had received no damage on the starboard, but some of the planks had been unnailed here and there according to custom to permit of air entering the hold. One morning, the crowd which was gazing at it witnessed an accident. The crew was busy bending the sails. The topman, who had to take the upper corner of the main topsail on the starboard, lost his balance. He was seen to waver. The multitude thronging the arsenal quay uttered a cry. The man's head overbalanced his body. The man fell around the yard with his hands outstretched towards the abyss. On his way, he seized the foot rope, first with one hand, then with the other, and remained hanging from it. The sea lay below him at a dizzy depth. The shock of his fall had imparted to the foot rope a violent swinging motion. The man swayed back and forth at the end of that rope, like a stone in a sling. It was incurring a frightful risk to go to his assistance. Not one of the sailors, all fishermen of the coast, recently levied for the service, dared to attempt it. In the meantime, the unfortunate topman was losing his strength. His anguish could not be discerned on his face, but his exhaustion was visible in every limb. His arms were contracted in horrible twitchings. Every effort which he made to reascend served to augment the oscillations of the foot rope. He did not shout, for fear of exhausting his strength. All were awaiting the minute when he should release his hold on the rope, and from instant to instant heads were turned aside that his fall might not be seen. There are moments when a bit of rope, a pole, the branch of a tree is life itself, and it is a terrible thing to see a living being detach himself from it and fall like ripe fruit. All at once, a man was seen climbing into the rigging with the agility of a tiger cat. This man was dressed in red. He was a convict. He wore a green cap. He was a life convict. On arriving on a level with the top, a gust of wind carried away his cap, and allowing a perfectly white head to be seen, he was not a young man. A convict employed on board with a detachment from the galleys had, in fact, at the very first instant, hastened to the officer of the watch, and in the midst of the consternation and the hesitation of the crew, while all the sailors were trembling and drawing back, he had asked the officer's permission to risk his life to save the topman. At an affirmative sign from the officer, he had broken the chain riveted to his ankle with one blow of a hammer. Then he had caught up a rope and had dashed into the rigging. No one noticed. At the instant, with what ease that chain had been broken. It was only later on that the incident was recalled. In a twinkling, he was on the yard. He paused for a few seconds and appeared to be measuring it with his eye. 3 seconds, during which the breeze swayed the topman at the extremity of a thread, seemed centuries to those who were looking on. At last, the convict raised his eyes to heaven and advanced a step. The crowd drew a long breath. He was seen to run out along the yard. On arriving at the point, he fastened the rope which he had brought to it and allowed the other end to hang down. Then he began to descend the rope, hand over hand, and the anguish was indescribable. Instead of one man suspended over the gulf, there were two. One would have said it was a spider coming to seize a fly. Only here, the spider brought life, not death. 10,000 glances were fastened on this group. Not a cry. Not a word. The same tremor contracted every brow. All mouths held their breath as though they feared to add the slightest puff to the wind which was swaying the two unfortunate men. In the meantime, the convict had succeeded in lowering himself to a position near the sailor. It was high time. 1 minute more, and the exhausted and despairing man would have allowed himself to fall into the abyss. The convict had moored him securely with the cord to which he clung with one hand, while he was working with the other. At last, he was seen to climb back on the yard, and to drag the sailor up after him. He held him there a moment to allow him to recover his strength. Then he grasped him in his arms and carried him, walking on the yard himself to the cap, and from there to the maintop, where he left him in the hands of his comrades. At that moment, the crowd broke into applause. Old convict sergeants among them wept, and women embraced each other on the quay. And all voices were heard to cry with a sort of tender rage, pardon for that man. He, in the meantime, had immediately begun to make his descent to rejoin his detachment. In order to reach them the more speedily, he dropped into the rigging and ran along one of the lower yards. All eyes were following him. At a certain moment, fear assailed them. Whether it was that he was fatigued or that his head turned, they thought they saw him hesitate and stagger. All at once, the crowd uttered a loud shout. The convict had fallen into the sea. The fall was perilous. The frigate, Algeciras, was anchored alongside the Orion, and the poor convict had fallen between the two vessels. It was to be feared that he would slip under one or the other of them. 4 men flung themselves hastily into the boat. The crowd cheered them on. Anxiety again took possession of all souls. The man had not risen to the surface. He had disappeared in the sea without leaving a ripple, as though he had fallen into a cask of oil. They sounded. They dived. In vain. The search was continued until the evening. They did not even find the body. On the following day, the Toulon newspaper printed these lines. November 17th, 1823. Yesterday, a convict belonging to the detachment on board of the Orion, on his return from rendering assistance to a sailor, fell into the sea and was drowned. The body has not yet been found. It is supposed that it is entangled among the piles of the Arsenal Point. This man was committed under the number 9430, and his name was Jean Valjean. Thank you for joining Bite at a Time Books today, while we read a bite of one of your favorite classics. Again, my name is Bree Carlile, and I hope you come back tomorrow for the next bite of Les Miserables. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at biteatatimebooks.com and check out the shop. You can check out the show notes or our website, biteatatimebooks.com, for the rest of the links for our show. We'd love to hear from you on social media as well.